Hello and welcome to this lecture on Plato. We'll be studying his writings from the Meno. He'll take an understanding of virtue and connect it to his theories of how we come to know stuff, for him, innate knowledge. And then we'll look at whether or not it could be taught, and if it can be, then who teaches it, who taught them. Hold off on that. We began the course by just simply looking at an understanding of what philosophy is and what the parameters of, and then we looked at critical thinking and exactly how one then forms judgments, walks through terms, the exact, unambiguous, clear, and such, and then the argument actually is situated within the syllogism. So remember, that's not philosophy proper, but it is a tool of philosophy. This now starts the beginning of our understanding or our study of philosophical thought. So in this first section of the course, we're going to be looking at epistemology, which is the word that simply means knowledge. So we're going to ask, how does one know something? And Plato's a fine place to begin with that. Now, when you ask something in regards of can virtue be taught, it might be our inclination to immediately respond to that. Like, in other words, to decide whether it can or cannot be, and then to prove our point. But philosophy always starts with something that's much more basic. So if you were to ask somebody, can virtue be taught, or if somebody were to ask you, it might be a better question to ask in return exactly what is virtue. So when we hear the word virtue, it is a habit that we form things as human beings in our lives. So we think of, justice and prudence and such. But the Greek word arete, it does not refer to those specific things. It literally means excellence. So in other words, for something to have virtue, it's going to be able to do that which it was designed to do. So let's look at a knife. A knife can have a virtue if it does all the things that a knife is supposed to do. So, does it fit in our hand well? How is the handle formed? Is the blade stable and sturdy? Is it wide enough for whatever we're doing, or thin enough if you're doing deboning? Is it sharp? So if it does all those things, we would say that this knife has virtue. In other words, it does what it is supposed to do. The knowledge that we have comes from what the thing is. So if we understand what the thing is, and then its excellence is connected to how well it does that which is intended to do, then knowledge flows from this. All right, so this is how our understanding of things begin. Now, Meno was, who was not an Athenian. All right, he's asking Socrates, like, why is it that you don't know exactly what this thing is that virtue has? Right, Gorgias, who is a sophist. Let me say it this way. I'll make it clear for you. Sophistry, practiced by sophists in the ancient Greek world, were almost like hired guns when it came to arguing. They were more interested in how to win an argument, in other words, to subdue your opponent, than to come to truth. Socrates, who's an Athenian, despises that. Here the only goal is to get the truth. So the idea is to ask questions. So there's nothing from his point of view as an Athenian to admit ignorance. So when he's asked what is virtue, he has no problem saying, well, I don't know. Can you please tell me what virtue is? Because the whole thing is, how do I get to this? So I'll say, what do you say is virtue? So something else that happens there, when you see two people having a discussion like this, you can see the role of questioner and questioned. It gets a little bit reversed. So now it's Socrates. He's asking the question back to Meno. And Meno responds using, various examples and such. So during his explanation, he'll talk about the excellence, by here he means virtue, of a male or a female or a child or an old person. Right? So there's always these different virtues that are linked to different stages of our life. And, Socrates, when he responds to this, he says, okay, look, you gave me a plethora of answers. You gave me so many different understandings of virtue that I'm not even quite sure what to do. Now, this is his way of continuing the investigation. So think just, when you're in a conversation, if somebody sort of overwhelms you with responses, it's almost like a swarm of bees coming at you, and you're trying to find a way to move through it, and it gets a little hard to do it, one by one, per se, right? So the idea here is like, you could talk about virtue in terms of management of city, virtue in managing a home. So Socrates begins to query Meno, and he's wondering if justice and moderation, are they needed in any of these particular enterprises that we do? Meno concludes that justice is a virtue, but still Socrates wants to know if Meno thinks it's a virtue or is it a virtue itself? And Socrates, he does the same thing about, shapes and colors, and you could read that, I think it's through like 74, being 74C in the reading. And Socrates points out that calling something by a single name doesn't make them all the same, you know. So, like, shape is that, where the solid ends, So if we were looking at a circle, picture the circle being solid red. Well, the shape is contained by the ends of that, and color has like this, effluence from the shapes. So anyway, Meno, and perhaps you're wondering, where is he going with all of this? Socrates says that, like, look, when friends want to interrogate each other, they should answer gently and dialectically. Even Meno offers a definition of virtue. He offers it by saying it's to delight in fine things and be capable of them. But Socrates wants to know, like, what about the condition of the ignorance of these fine things? In other words, we could desire many things we could believe are good, but maybe they are in fact bad. I mean, have we ever thought something is good? Like, think of like diet. We might think this was good for us to eat. We find out later that it's bad. So we're actually in error. And actually these bad things, they can make us miserable and unhappy. So Socrates leads Meno to conclude that, maybe virtue is the power to bring about good things. That would include health and property and such, political power. And Socrates continues to question Meno, and he adds justice and moderation to these good things. Now, this may all seem like where is it going, but remember, he's an Athenian. He's into asking questions, and he doesn't mind staying in long conversations. It's the plague of our modern world, where we do not like to have long, lengthy conversations to investigate things. We just kind of like, give me the answer, that kind of thing. So he's trying to think, like, how can justice be part of virtue? He wants to know, like, what is the whole of virtue, not just, what is something of it. So here, Meno, you can get a sense, he's being dragged out of the cave. Socrates is telling him all these various things, making him perplexed. And he even says, you're making me numb in spirit and tongue. Meno says, how are you going to search for it, when you have no idea what it is? It's kind of like looking up, I know we don't have physical dictionaries per se as much anymore, but how would you look up a word that you don't know how to spell? I mean, you only know what it starts with. It gets a little hard to do that, right? So anyway, Socrates says, like, look, he's going to start basing his next idea, like, on this immortality of the soul. I'll get into that in a sec here. But he's trying to get to the bottom of exactly, what this thing is. In other words, if we can get to what the thing is, its form. Now, the reason why this word eidos and form are important, because if you can remember Plato's cave allegory, the point to getting outside of the cave was to see reality. And what was outside of the cave? Those were forms. And remember, forms are essences. So the perfect color blue was out there. The perfect giraffe was out there, whatever it was. And that was genuine reality. And the only way to get to that, for a person who believes in reincarnation, he understands that his soul once existed in that form, in that realm of forms. And now, as a human being, it's forgotten those things. So remember, this is about, can something be taught? What he's going to say, I'll give it to you up front, he's going to say that you really don't teach things. What we do is we recollect them. So think about if we lived in this heavenly realm where all the perfections were, and as we get born here, we no longer remember those things, but they're still part of us, so we just need somebody to draw those out. This is where he's going to start. And he asks various questions, because he's still trying to get to the bottom of what these things are. Like, what is the excellence of health? Sometimes we ask what makes us healthy, but don't we analogously also call other things healthy? Like we might call, unseasoned chicken healthy to eat, but it's not healthy in the same way that we are. So, what he's going to do now is he asked for a slave boy, and he wants a slave boy who has no experience in geometry, and that way if he's going to do it as an illustration to teach him, not to teach him something, but to help him recollect. he can't have that person to know something before. So he almost wants to start with somebody with a blank slate. Let's leave it at that. So here's what he does. He gets this slave boy, and he makes a square, 4 equal lines, 2 by 2, all right? And he asks the slave boy, what does the area consist of? Well, the boy at least knows enough to say, well, it's 4 square feet, 2 by 2. And he says, oh, how many square feet would be twice as large of that? Okay, well, the slave boy knows, well, if you times that by 2, you have 8 square feet. Socrates affirms, slave boy, that doubling the lines would produce such a square that doubles the area, right? So if I have a 2 by 2, would I go to a 4 by 4? The slave boy seems, that seems like that would make sense to him. So he asked the slave boy, well, then what length of line? Because that really, what does that do? That gives you, if we did that, that would give us 16 square feet, 4 by 4. But we want to double it. So we want to go from 2 by 2, that's, 4 square feet. We want to get to 8 square feet. So you can't just double all the sides. That will wind up giving you 16 square feet, way off. The slave boy says, well, perhaps we're just doing it by half. So if we do it by half, that's 3 by 3. Now we have 9 square feet. And even within this, he goes, oh, by Zeus, that's true. So, we would say, oh my God, well, their God Zeus. So what he says, what you really need to do here is you need to have a diagonal across those squares. If you do a diagonal across those squares and connect those, that will give you the 8 square feet and therefore double it from a 2 by 2. Now, whether this is convincing to you or not, I want you to set that aside. I want you to try to follow his line of thinking and his point. What he has done here is he has simply tried to keep asking questions until the slave boy could get this and therefore understand it. In other words, the slave boy really was not taught. What the slave boy, what did happen to the slave boy was that he recollected. So this is something that can be known a priori. What that means is before experience. There are those things which we know by experience. Perhaps how to do, like how to cook something. But here's something that you don't need experience to know how to do. It'd be if I were to use the fallacy of the principle of non-contradiction. Like an apple cannot be ripe and unripe in the same way at the same time. That's obvious, but you don't need experience for that. Regardless of what we call ripe, we know that it can't be, whatever I call ripe, it can't be ripe and not ripe in the same way at the same time. So what happened here was all Socrates, this is Plato, but Socrates is in the dialogue with the slave boy, all Socrates did was demonstrate what was already known. So now he's starting to ask, it is now known what is not known, but he also knows what he knows. If that sounds confusing to you, leave it at this. Remember, this started out by, can virtue be taught? His first question was, I'm not even sure where virtue is. Now he's trying to get to the bottom of, are we really taught anything? So he's almost like undermining the entire argument. So he's not concluding here whether or not virtue is teachable. That's here on this next slide. Oh, by the way, I should say this, Aporia, this is almost like a mystery. Don't think of it like a puzzle, but it's almost like an incommensurable thing that's very difficult for us to resolve, okay? And that's probably how the slave boy understood it at this point. Okay. Now, we've all been told that there's no such thing as a bad question. Well, maybe there's no such thing as, there's nothing wrong with being inquisitive. Maybe that's a clearer way to say it. But there obviously is something wrong with a bad question. If you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the answer that you want. So remember, Socrates using the slave boy, he just drew out the knowledge that the boy already possessed, this a priori, and it was already innate, so it was just through a series of questions. So, did you notice, growth in knowledge, it always requires constant questioning for us, but we have to make sure that we're getting good questions, or we're never going to quite get to the knowledge that we want. So anyway, in this section, Meno returns to the question of whether or not virtue is something that is teachable or not. And he takes on the relation of, let's say, knowledge to virtue. He'll start there. Um, and he wonders if knowledge depends on, if it depends on knowledge, or if there's other things that are good. I mean, exactly how are we going to get to the bottom of this? So if Socrates believes that knowledge can be taught, the question is formed, if virtue is knowledge, then the answer is yes. And if virtue is not knowledge, then the answer is no, it cannot be taught. So he'll begin with this notion that, virtue is good. It's his beginning. But and I know this sounds like nitpicking, but I have to keep reiterating that philosophers don't let anything, no rock unturned. Let's say it that way. But he says, but if it's good, is good also something that's beneficial? In other words, there are other beneficial things like health and beauty and property, which are not beneficial if they're not used properly. So, Socrates uses an example of a brave man, who he thinks first, like this understanding. Then he might rush into something, but that's not really beneficial, So he's wondering, the virtue's got to be something in the soul. It's like it's prior to being beneficial or harmful. It's something in itself, right? Now, the reality is he literally sets this all aside. It's almost like he went down the side road and just put it off to the side. You got to get used to that. This is almost like, think of us thinking out loud, and then we just leave that and go on to the next thing. That's sort of how he's approaching it here. But now he's going to go back to this question: if something is teachable, then there must be teachers, and there must be learners, because that would validate, what is taught and what is learned. Now he enters another character here, Innate. And Innate, his father was wealthy and wise. So Innate, he became, wise by the wisdom and dedication that his father had given to him. So Socrates asked Innate, that shouldn't a good teacher, a doctor, and by the way, we'll leave it this way, shouldn't a good doctor teach others also to be doctors, and a good shoemaker teach others to be shoemakers, and a good flute player to teach others to be flute players? So he says to Innate about Meno, who wants to be a teacher of wisdom and virtue, to teach me wisdom and virtue, but, the sophists, they want pay for everything, because remember, they're hired guns. He wonders, are they swindling, and are they ruining the young by deceiving them? In other words, if they're being paid to teach these people something and you really can't teach it to them, it's something that they already know, then perhaps there's something else that's going on here. And he's wondering, he's almost like getting a dig in there, if you want to hear it that way. In other words, these people are swindling them. If you can't teach this, but they're being paid to teach it, didn't I just demonstrate with the slave that this is all about recollection just by asking the right questions? Anyway, Socrates has another point. In other words, some fathers can't teach their children. Maybe Innate, father, was able to do it because he was wealthy and wise and learned, but how do people whose fathers can't teach them, how is it that they know? So maybe there's something else, besides this that actually guides it. In other words, this idea of infinite regress. If I'm teaching you and somebody taught me and somebody taught the person who taught me, we can go back how far? It had to originate somewhere. So he's asking who taught the teachers and so on. There's got to be something else he's thinking that's going on about this. Now remember, this last little section here, it's not going to be a resolution. So he's going to leave. He's going to have something to say, I think it's this. But he's still trying to figure out exactly what is this that we're being taught. Remember, we're in this section of epistemology. How do we know? You're going to get a bunch of varied understandings of how people think we come to knowledge. This is just the first one. And if you don't agree with it, that's perfectly fine. But have a good critique of it. So he's wondering if there's something besides knowledge that actually guides people. And he's thinking, yes, there's two things. First of all, you could talk about knowledge and you could talk about true beliefs. And he doesn't think they're really within the human person by nature, but they exist, so they must be teachable. So, he thinks a man who guides correctly, he has these things. But Socrates is pushing back and saying, no, remember, I don't think virtue is teachable. So it must not really be knowledge. That's how this whole thing started, is virtue knowledge. He's finally getting around to that. He goes, I don't think virtue is knowledge because it can't be taught. But some people have this. So this is why they were unable to make others the same kind of person they are. This is why, fathers can't always make their children, as who they are. So he's thinking, we have this knowledge and we have true beliefs. And that's not quite the same. We can have a belief in something, but it must be true, and perhaps then that might become knowledge. So he's thinking, well, maybe virtue is not knowledge, but it's still something that we can believe to be true. That is perplexing for him. In other words, if it is something that is not knowledge, but it is true, well, where does it come from? Now remember, his theory is that outside the cave are the perfection of these forms. And by us recollecting when from the time when we existed in that realm of forms, that's really how we're coming to these things. So some of these things are true beliefs, even if they're not knowledge per se, because it can't be taught. So he's thinking this idea, it must be divine. He figures that it must reside within the divinity, and somehow then we have access to it. Now we're just going to stop there, and it might sound confusing to you, so I just want you to keep in mind exactly what he pieced together here. All he was really trying to do from the beginning was, remember he started the question, can virtue be taught? And as basic as that is, he didn't try to answer it. What he tried to say is, I'm not quite sure what virtue is. And if he determines that virtue is not knowledge, and that you don't teach, all you do is help someone to relect, then maybe it has to be something other than that, because we have this virtue, and we don't get it through knowledge. So it must be something of the divine. So we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up next time with Augustine, who plays off of this line of thinking.